This week in Power and Politics.
We knew that this red mirage would turn out to be a blue ocean. And that's what happened, I think.
After thousands of absentee ballots were counted, the tables turned and many Democratic incumbents proved victorious.
These races will all improve for Democrats in New York State as the absentee ballots are counted.
This is a season of new beginnings. This election was the most important election of our lifetime. Nothing could be taken for granted this time around.
With us today, fresh off their re-election announcements, Congressman Tom Suozzi and State Senator Kevin Thomas. News 12's Power and Politics begins right now. Welcome to News 12's Power and Politics. I'm Rich Barrabi. It is nearly 3 weeks past Election Day, and yet still many candidates are just finding out if they won or lost their races. Some are even still waiting for a final result. The unprecedented amount of pandemic-driven absentee ballots had both sides of the aisle in a holding pattern of sorts, patiently but nervously awaiting their fate. Congressman Tom Suozzi had to wait for the paper, as they call it, to come in, but the absentee ballots clinched a third term in office for the Glen Cove Democrat, and Congressman Suozzi joins us now. Thank you for being here.
Hey, Rich, how are you? Thanks so much for having me on.
Congressman, the wait must have been tough, especially because, when you looked at election night, you were actually trailing your Republican challenger, George Santos, by about 4,000 votes. But that was misleading because now with these other absentees coming in, you're up well over 40,000 and counting.
Yeah, that's right. I really wasn't nervous because I've been doing this for a long time and I understand how it works. And I knew exactly what was happening when I saw there were 100,000 absentee ballots and most of the people, over 50%, were registered Democrats and less than 20% were registered Republicans. So I felt pretty good on election night. But of course, I've been getting condolence calls for weeks, people calling me up and say, "Oh, are you okay? Is everything all right?" But I explained to them that I felt pretty good. And my opponent called me up to concede earlier this week, and the numbers are in. There's only about 2,000 votes still left to be counted. It's a terrible system. It needs to be fixed in New York. But I've got about 55, 56% of the vote, so I'm very happy.
It's interesting because this was almost like watching what happened on the national scene, but on a delay, right? I mean, you looked at President Trump on election night. He was winning some of those key battleground states, and then when you woke up the next morning, Joe Biden was in the lead, and he never looked back. Similar situation here.
Well, could you imagine if New York State was a swing state and the whole country was waiting 2 or 3 weeks for the results because they had to wait a week? The New York law is that you have to wait 1 week after Election Day to start counting the paper because they want to make sure that every ballot that is postmarked as of Election Day, including military ballots, are actually in the House before they start counting them. So I think we have to change the system and figure out how to do this a little more quickly. I think that mail-in voting is going to become more and more common as time goes on. It's been done in certain states for over a decade, and the people, are expecting to have results, and they're not going to wait 2 or 3 weeks like this.
Do you think the delay, Congressman, shakes people's confidence in the system, even if everything's on the up and up? You heard George Santos have allegations of voter suppression. He was on this show last week. He said he had evidence, but he couldn't provide any here, and then he conceded a couple of days later. Are you worried that, at least people wondering, is this real?
Well, one of the big challenges we face in our country right now is that people feel they can just say whatever they want, regardless of what the truth is. And they're not held as accountable as they once were, because in the old days, you knew that Newsday and News 12, the New York Times, let's say, other papers of record on Long Island would hold people accountable if they were not telling the truth. And now, because media is so fractured and people just go, where they find sources that agree with them, and that's not just, Fox News versus MSNBC, but it's also all these splinter websites, social media pages, where people just say whatever they want. And it's very hard to hold people accountable as to what the truth is. It's why journalism is so important. When our country was first established, based upon the concept that all men and women are created equal, it was also based on the fact that you can't really trust the politicians. And that's why we set up the separation of powers. That's why we set up the rule of law. That's why we set up the 3 branches of government. But that's why we also set up the freedom of the press. And we need the press to hold politicians accountable for what they say, when they're telling the truth or not. And now because of a lot of different factors, people are assaulting the credibility of the press. Now, most people who are journalists have to follow a code of ethics. They've got to follow certain rules. The problem is some people present themselves as being journalists these days, and they're not really journalists, they're entertainers. And they're not following the rules, and they're just trying to sell to get people to watch their show so they can sell advertising. So we're in a big state of flux right now. Cable news, as hard as it is to imagine, is relatively new. And social media is relatively new.
Even newer.
What's that?
Even newer, right.
And so we have to figure out these fringe voices that are controlling the conversation, the far right, the far left. These are the people that are most active. Then they're being helped by social media and by cable news. And then there's our foreign adversaries. I don't want to sound too much like a conspiracy theorist, but it's the reality. I know this for a fact. The Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians, the North Koreans are using social media and trying to spread disinformation to try and foment civil unrest in the United States of America regularly. They're always trying to do it. So the truth is really important. We take for granted in America, everybody, we're a Judeo-Christian society with the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not lie. Well, we got a big problem with that. And there are other places in the world that don't even follow that basic idea is thou shalt not lie.
Let's talk about what's happening in Washington right now. The Democrats retain control of the House, but it's a slimmer majority. Nancy Pelosi reelected as the House Speaker. She claims there's great unity among Democrats. Color me skeptical on that. Take a listen.
I wish that you could have seen the nominations and the acceptance speeches, because then you could have seen the common thread, the unity of our caucus. The values and vision.
Congressman, that's how the Speaker says it played out. Is that true?
Well, I think that there's a real battle between the moderates and the progressives, and I think it's an unhealthy battle. On the big picture stuff, we all agree that we have to address coronavirus. We all agree that we should try and do a bipartisan deal on infrastructure. We all agree that we should try and make healthcare more affordable. So we got to focus on these big picture stuff and get some singles and doubles right away under the new administration, instead of all these little issues that pull us apart. And we need to do the same thing with the Republicans. We're all saying, hey, let's come together, let's come together. Well, the Republicans are saying, hey, you didn't come together when Trump was in office. You've been beating him up for the past 4 years. And the Democrats say, hey, everybody's been beating up Obama when Obama was president. McConnell wouldn't do anything with him. If we continue along this path of an eye for an eye, then everyone ends up blind. That's not my quote, that's Mahatma Gandhi. But we have to figure out how we can get people to start working together for the common good to try and serve the people we elect. People are desperate for us to solve the problems, and we've got big problems. I mean, coronavirus we're freaking out right now again because
Let's pick it up there, because that's the main problem, right? And so there was a feeling that you've got this election looming. It's going to be tough to get a deal. There was no deal. Now the election's over. Do you see any room here, or are we waiting now for a Biden administration? That would set us back even further before getting relief to everyday Americans.
Listen, I've been pushing for a deal for more than 6 months, and as have many Democrats. And unfortunately, Mitch McConnell, who you just had on the screen, the senator from Kentucky, who's the majority leader of the Senate, as saying we don't want to do a blue state bailout, which is, as I've said many times, is the height of hypocrisy, because every year New York State sends more money to the federal government than we get back, more than any other state in the United States of America. His state of Kentucky is one of the biggest net takers from the federal government. We're donors, he's a taker, and his state gets as much money as we're giving to the federal government each year, right to his state, which is a very low income, poor state, quite frankly. So listen, we have to move beyond this stuff. That's why I'm in the Problem Solvers Caucus. We made a deal. There was no talk about a deal for 5 months. Problem Solvers came together. We got 25 Democrats to say we'll agree to liability reform. We've got 25 Republicans to say we'll agree for money for $500 billion, $500 billion for state and local aid, as well as all the other stuff: unemployment insurance, PPP program for small businesses, money for testing and tracing. And we got people negotiating again, but it never came to fruition. I'm hoping that McConnell and Schumer and Pelosi and McCarthy and the president, quite frankly, can finally come together. I'm just so concerned about all these people that are suffering. They're losing their businesses. People can't pay their rent. We see the cases spiking again. We really need people to work together for the common good. You have to put country before party.
In 30 seconds or so, obviously, Thanksgiving just a few days away. Any advice for people here? This is a tough one. You know, you see the CDC guidelines, but you miss your family. Again, not much time left, but just your thoughts on it.
You know, my father-in-law passed away early this year from the coronavirus, died within 36 hours of getting it. He was 92 years old. My mother-in-law is in an assisted living facility. My brother and his wife don't want to bring their kids to the house for Thanksgiving because they just don't feel comfortable going to any kind of group. You know, we used to have parties, 20, 30 people. We're down to 6 people we're doing a party this year. And, you know, it's not the same, but we have to be safe. Use the technology, use your Skype and your Zoom and things like that. Make your phone calls. Thank God for the gifts that you do have, and try and move forward in a positive way. It's a tough time. We'll get through it together, but we really need to work with it.
We're going to have to leave it there, but good advice. Congressman Tom Suozzi, thank you for joining us once again. You're watching News 12's Power and Politics. We'll be right back after this.